Hello, viewers. Today we will be discussing the topic globalization and social inequality. We all know that globalization has affected the world in more ways than one. Whether Brexit, offshoring, or China's growing middle class, globalization is at the core of many issues today. In fact, globalization has been given much credit for changing the world and potentially too much of blame also. It has been debated that globalization is at the root of social and economic inequality. In fact, there is a raging debate among economists, political scientists, social policy makers that globalization has accentuated social and economic inequalities. There is a common narrative which considers globalization as the cause of socio-economic inequalities. By linking and shifting low-skilled jobs from wealthier countries to poorer countries, economic integration has increased inequalities within countries while lowering inequality between them. However, viewers, the story is much more complex than what it appears. There cannot be any straightforward answer that globalization has increased inequalities or decreased inequalities. In fact, there are two sides of the spectrum. One thing we need to start is a number of assumptions. It is true that people living around the 80th percentile of global income, for example, the poor and the middle class of the developed world, has seen very little real income gain from globalization. Whereas many of the poor and middle class of the developing countries have benefited greatly from the globalization forces. At the same time, the global elite seem to have experienced greater access to income, increase in income, while the poorest people in the world have just not benefited at all. Clearly, the benefits of economic change have not affected the people around the world equally. Yet globalization is considered to be one of the factors for unequal distribution of the gains of liberalization and deregulation. When studying globalization and inequality, we need to reflect upon other global developments. Globalization cannot be studied in isolation from other developments. We also need to take into account the collapse of the Soviet Union and Japan's period of economic stagnation. Therefore, when studying the relationship between globalization and social inequalities, we need to focus on other recent developments also. For instance, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Japan's economic recession should also be taken into account when we are trying to understand inequalities between and across countries. We also need to understand that post the collapse of Soviet Union and Japan's economic recession, there has been a decline in the income of the poor and the middle class, but that cannot be attributed directly to the forces of globalization. Therefore, we need to understand that along with globalization, there were certain other contributors to social inequality, such as new technology, unequal education, deregulation, and differing social welfare policies. All these identifiers should be studied in detail to analyze and examine the relationship between globalization and inequalities. Let us now start our discussion with some basic assumptions. First, we need to think not just in terms of relative inequality or absolute inequality, because we often find that economists thinking in terms of relative inequality, but other scholars think in terms of absolute inequality. Because if you try to analyze, for example, a 10% increase in the income of the top rich and the top poor in 5% of different countries does not yield the same results. A 10% increase in net income of the global rich will automatically lead to higher economic gains for them. And that cannot be equated with the 10% rise in income of the poor in the developing countries of the world. Therefore, it is time to understand that inequalities vary across class, income range, and between cultures and races. When we are trying to understand socio-economic inequalities, we also should try to think in terms of inequalities between the developed regions of a country and remote corners of that very country. At the same time, we also need to equalize and find out whether there is one contributing factor which leads to rising and accentuating inequalities across the globe. Now, where do we start the equality-inequality debate? While globalists think that globalization has led to greater income among the people around the world, anti-globalists, on the other hand, believe that it is globalization which is at the root cause of all inequalities between countries and around the world. Therefore, we need to understand that when globalists are trying to focus on decrease in inequalities, they are actually referring to the benefits of free trade and liberalization. On the other hand, when anti-globalists are trying to focus on accentuating inequalities, they are looking into the reasons how free trade has not liberalized the entire world. Now, globalization is always presented as a blanket force impacting all nations in a similar manner. Now, this very assumption is flawed. But countries have different starting points and varying tendencies to accept or resist globalization. For example, we need to understand that the advanced countries were far more and better equipped to handle the globalization forces than the LDCs or the least developed countries. So, the starting point being different for different countries, automatically globalization will have different results in different countries of the world, and this is one fact that we should not lose sight of. National specific institutions such as employment and industrial relations system, education system, the degree of decommodification from the welfare regime, and migration from different countries should be taken to be as important filters in the globalization process. We also know that there are different national variations of occupational structures, industries, patterns of labor capital negotiations, strike frequencies, and collective agreements on wages, job security, labor conditions, and work hours. All of these factors should be taken into consideration when we are trying to analyze national variations of equality inequality. Globalization operates to disperse and fragment these national structures via the threat of competition, which has been posed because of the increased demands and flexibility of the domestic labor force. We also need to understand that there has been a change in the quality of domestic labor patterns because of the migration of labor from low wages to higher wages, from low developing countries to advanced industrialized countries. Now, the debate on the distributional effect of globalization is often polarized between 2 points of view. One school of thought argues that globalization leads to a rising tide of income which raises all boats. That means everybody's income is increased as a result of globalization. However, even low income groups can come out as winners from globalization in absolute terms. However, the optimistic view has parallels with the Kuznets hypothesis from the development literature, which proposes that even though inequality might rise in the initial period of industrial development, it eventually declined as the country's transition to industrialization was completed. The opposing school argues that although globalization may improve overall income, the benefits are not shared equally among the citizens of the country, with clear losers in relative and absolute terms. Moreover, widening income disparities did not only raise welfare and social concerns but may also limit the drivers of growth, because the opportunities created by the process of globalization may not be fully exploited. That is the reason why post-globalization, we find the state has not withdrawn itself, but there has been a reconceptualization of the state in terms of more welfare measures, more social security measures, despite rising income among groups. The sustainability of globalization will also depend on maintaining broad support across population which could be adversely affected by rising inequality. Therefore, we need to understand that inequality or equality has to be judged and analyzed in terms of population variations. Let us start off with another point of discussion. Is inequality only economic, or there are alternative approaches to studying inequality? Classical sociological approaches believe that inequality is a multi-dimensional construct. It is not just economic, but it is social, it is cultural, and it can vary across races and cultures. Studies that deviate and expand upon inequality beyond income are, however, rare. What I am trying to focus on is the fact that though inequality is multi-dimensional, yet most of the studies on inequality has focused on income inequality or economic inequality. The only exception is the study done by Amartya Sen, who considers inequality in terms of social factors by identifying development as freedom, connecting equality with freedom, and providing a socio-political dimension to equality. More recently, Gosling and Baker introduced a multi-dimensional operationalization of inequality by examining not just income but also health and education as indicators of inequality or equality. Beyond the actual measure, there is also a question whether inequality is studied as just unequal distribution of income within countries or between countries, or we will study inequality as a combination of both intra-country and inter-country developments. Now let us try to understand, if it is inequality that we are trying to study, what type of inequalities are we going to study? Now, if you try to analyze inequality, we will get two perspectives. One is inequality of opportunity and the other one is inequality of outcome. Now, inequality of opportunities can be rectified by providing various constitutional and legislative measures in order to provide beneficial outcome by providing equal opportunities for all. For instance, various constitutions around the world provide for social security measures, affirmative action plans in order to ensure that everybody is entitled to equal opportunity. But the problem, student, is not equality of opportunity. The problem is inequality of outcome. Can we guarantee equality of outcome? Now, in order to understand equality of outcome and how it can be guaranteed, we need to first define what is inequality of outcome. Now, inequality, if it is basically inequality of outcome, then there should be certain indicators of inequality of outcome. Now, the European Commission has provided a broad definition of inequality of outcome. It defines inequality of outcome as how the income earned in an economy is distributed across the population. There is another important aspect to inequality of income. Whenever we are speaking of inequality, we actually have in mind the poor and the marginalized segment of the society, and this has also been identified by the European Commission. To quote the European Commission report of 1984, the poor shall be taken to mean persons, families, and groups of persons whose resources, whether material, cultural, or social, are so limited as to exclude them from the minimum acceptable way of life in the member state in which they live. So, when we are trying to understand inequality of outcome, we would try to understand whether the outcome affects the poor, the middle class, and the rich in an equitable manner or not. Among researchers using population-weighted inequality measure, results show that there has been a decline in income inequality across countries, which means that there can be various ways of analyzing inequality of income. One way is to understand how income distribution happens across population. And a study of different countries of the world have shown that inequality among the population has declined. Using population weight income inequality data from 138 countries from 1979 to 2000, noted scholar Salai Martin, for example, showed that the level of income inequality across countries declined sharply over time. However, when income shares are examined by quintiles, we see that income inequality has increased mainly in the middle and high income countries and less in the low income countries. There is also evidence that income inequality across countries far exceeds that of inequality within countries that has grown across time. To take into account another study conducted by Gosling and Baker state that the world's largest inequalities are not defined by race, class, or gender, but by national borders. Average income in the richest economies of the world far exceeds those in the poorest countries, which estimates of income that are 40-50 times greater than the poorer countries. Now, we need to understand and believe in the basic assumption that the starting point or the beginning point of the advanced countries after globalization was different, and the experience of the poor and least developed economies are different. Therefore, if the starting point is different, of course it will affect the results in the advanced industrialist countries and the poor developing countries of the world. This reflects the increasing divergence between rich and poor countries. Therefore, we need to understand that instead of globalization acting as a point of convergence, it is increasing divergence among countries and between countries. Now, let us try to understand globalization and intra-country inequality. What happens within the country? There is no straitjacket formula to say that within the country income inequalities has increased or decreased. Examining the Gini coefficient of income inequality, for example, Alderson and Nelson demonstrate that globalization explains the longitudinal trend of increasing inequality within 16 OECD countries. By examining the impact of globalization measures such as direct investment outflow, north-south trade, and net migration rate over the period from 1967 to 1992, they find that rising inequality within countries such as United States of America, Australia, and Denmark, and declining and then rising inequality in countries such as Germany, Japan, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. So, across countries, trends are different. Within advanced countries also, the trends are different. One of the pointers of globalization is an increased outflow of international trade. But the question is, Does international trade also accentuate inequalities across countries? Now, trade is almost always considered to be a tangible measure of analyzing the potential effect of globalization on economies. However, if we try to analyze trade, we need to go through the North-South debate. World trade, trade integration and financial openness have significantly grown since the late 1980s. World trade, in fact, has grown 5 times from 1980s to 2005, while trade openness increasing particularly between the former Eastern Bloc and the developing Asian countries. Integration and financial openness has also intensified between the advanced economies. Therefore, one thing is clear. Outflow of trade and trade negotiations between different countries have increased across the world. Trade is one factor of globalization that has the potential to increase inequality in industrialized economies due to the fact that it reduces the average wage and enhances inequalities in the relative wage between skilled and unskilled laborers. It reduces wage in the north due to the fact that wage of the workers are in competition with the low wages of the developing countries of the world. Herein we need to understand that wage competition also leads to differential outcome in terms of trade. While employing high income workers, the trade outflow would be different and the results would be different. Similar trade with low-wage workers from the global south will have differential outcome in advanced industrialized and multinational corporate houses. Apart from trade, are there any other indicators or points of reference to understand the relationship between globalization and inequality? Let us try to study the relationship, if any, between FDI, foreign direct investment, and inequality. Foreign direct investment is considered to be one of the popular results of globalization. More intensive competition and the softening of trade barriers opens new markets for firms in industrialized countries. We also need to understand that foreign direct investment is one of the many reasons for increased investment by multinational corporations in least developing countries or low developing countries. Globalization prompts a capital flight among firms in the sense that many rich industrial houses are more keen to invest in foreign developing countries of the world. So here we need to understand that there is an outflow of capital from the advanced industrialist countries to the developing countries of the world. Firms in search of lower labor costs and more lenient tax system or employment regulations invest abroad. So there is automatically a shift of capital from the advanced countries to the developing countries. As a result, there is a process of what we can say deindustrialization in the developed countries and more industrialization or potential industrialization in the developing countries. Therefore, we can say the outcome of foreign direct investment will also see different results in advanced as well as developing countries of the world. Now, this deindustrialization entails a shift also from typically higher wages in the manufacturing and industrial segment in the more industrialized sector to the replaced by, say, comparatively lower wages in developing countries of the world. Conversely, globalization appears to decrease the level of inequality in many developing countries via the growth of industrialization. Thus, here we can say that foreign direct investment acts as an equalizer in terms of distributing the income effects from industrialized countries to low developing countries of the world. So while other indicators may said to have accentuated inequalities, here we can see a type of an equality outcome in terms of shifting of investment from developed countries to developing countries. These factors operate together to decrease the level of inequality in the countries where there is more foreign direct investment. This contrasting impact of inequality are therefore a key reason why the results differ, whether countries are population weighted or can be treated as different units. Globalization has also seen an increased outflow of labor from developing countries to industrialized countries. Automatically, a question arises whether migration aids inequality or kind of facilitates it. Now, it is said that today not only industries are mobile, not only investment or trade is mobile, labor is also mobile, and there has been a shift of labor from donor countries to receiving countries. Different countries have different levels of migrants, which likewise contribute to the level of inequality in that particular society. Borges points to migration in the United States of America as a central factor for contributing to inequality. He further says that immigration is related to inequality in the context that both immigration and inequality coincide with one another, and that there is a bifurcation of low and highly skilled migrants, which also leads to a growth of low skilled migrants, because low skilled migrants can also be given low wages and be adjusted within the industrial systems of the advanced capitalist countries. Alderson and Nelson argue that the combination of high immigration rate with an immigrant population characterized by low average skills or even high skills variance has been seen as a certain recipe for increased inequality. This can be related to Grusky's work of income disparities as a function of race, class, and gender. Another very interesting aspect concerning globalization and inequality debate is the rise of the IT sector. Can the IT sector be said to have accentuated inequalities in the countries? Let us try to understand that. Now, it goes without any debate that around the world there has been an IT revolution. Greater digitization of products and services, microcomputers, investment in more cables, and countries around the world, right from low developing countries to advanced countries, are investing more in the information technology systems. These accelerate the liberalization of financial transactions and communication. One way to ensure the impact of ICT is by examining the intensification of ICT capital investment within countries, such as higher national expenditures on computer hardware and software and telecommunication equipment. Others have measured it by examining the level of socio-technical interconnectedness via measures such as the number of internet hosts and users per capita and other related communication technology availability and usage within a society. ICT, together with liberalized and internationalized financial transactions, create a financial what is called supermarket for global business to business transaction, stock exchange, cross-border banking, and finance that stress across the world on a real-time basis. New technology has also prompted a new wave of automation characterized by flexible and accelerated production processes. It is not only increased production, but there has been a shift from the demand for low-skilled workers to highly skilled IT and software technical experts. So much so that there has been a change in the way labor force is analyzed, examined post-IT revolution. And this change in the IT sector not only covers the advanced countries of the world, but also the developing countries of the world. Now, there are multiple and diverse approaches to analyze globalization and inequality. D. Massey, in his work Globalization and Inequality Explaining American Exceptionalism, addresses the resurgence of income inequality in the United States. In his study, Massey points out that the most unequal societies in the world have resulted in within country inequality. So, advanced industrialized nations witness greater inequality within countries. He positions these key differences in terms of unique institutional filters within the country, which exposes individuals at the bottom of the socio-economic hierarchy more overtly to the forces of globalization. Massey traces this inequality to America's legacy of racism, where the political system aids the already wealthy to further enhance their position, whereas the lower rungs of the minorities in the American society suffer from severe marginalization as a result of the forces of globalization. Another important trend to note is the fact that the structural adjustment policies which has been imbibed in various South Asian and Southeast Asian economies have also aided inequalities between countries. According to Joseph Stiglitz, globalization and more specifically the Washington Consensus lacked in attention to governance and did not adequately consider the impact of economic policies on the state and its role, thus failing to address both the issues of poverty as well as inequality. What is more, the companies of rich countries in fact benefited from it because of the easing of tariffs. If we look more closely, China and India are reducing poverty, but that does not mean they are reducing the level of inequalities. In a number of studies conducted, it has been observed that while poverty has declined in India, inequality has accentuated because of the forces of liberalization and deregulation. Therefore, in the opinion of Joseph Stiglitz, the global south is worse off than it was before globalization. Now, we need to understand that globalization by itself is not a problem. How we utilize the forces of globalization, it is what needs much more attention than what it is given. What can we deduce from today's discussion? To conclude, while some countries benefit from globalization, others have not clearly benefited much from the forces of globalization. As Hans Rosling once said, globalization has been accused of creating the West and the rest. On the whole, the Washington Consensus, Structural Adjustment Program, policies of the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, global liberal integration did not create an effective solution for reducing inequalities between countries or across countries. Globalization and free trade would be good if all the participants are equal actors. Neoliberalism has created a situation where, while the poor benefits, the rich still get richer and the gap does not appear to become smaller. The rich gets richer, the poor also benefits. The gap keeps on rising. At the last point in conclusion, it can be safely said that globalization is one factor but cannot be said to be the sole factor accentuating inequalities. And finally, we must understand that there should be a more nuanced approach to understanding and finding a solution to reducing inequalities rather than trying to search in the facilities provided by globalization to decrease inequalities between countries. Globalization cannot be blamed for all the negative impact pertaining to socio-economic inequalities. There are other forces at work which increase inequalities both between countries as well as within countries. Thank you.